Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof for the 24th of March 2024. And spring is advancing apace, there's more sunlight, it is just, I get the feeling in the air of positivity, of a new start to the year. But when I look at the news, it's the same old sort of thing, which is war and destruction. And my goodness, last night was an example of that. The good news is that Ukraine, I think, had the better of it by striking Crimea quite phenomenally in terms of taking some more naval scalps. A couple of ships hit, a lot of important infrastructure in Crimea, and indeed an airport as well, an airbase, sorry. The Russians have returned to striking as they did a couple of nights ago with missiles and drones across the whole of Ukraine, really, trying to particularly take out energy infrastructure. I think still a lot of news to filter through concerning what the Ukrainians have suffered overnight. We'll go first of all, to the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, and all the usual caveats apply, of course, and you can find them in the description to the video below. We have a pretty heavy day for the Russians again. 990 personnel lost is a massive number. It's not over 1,000, but it's the upper end of the scale. Our anchoring of where the scale is somewhat skewed at the moment because the last few months have been so bad for the Russians and arguably for the Ukrainians as well. But just looking at the Russian figures, the numbers have been often over 1,000, but even 990, just below 1,000, is just a phenomenal loss statistic for the Russians. 24 tanks is a very high number of tanks in one single day. 28 APVs, armoured personnel vehicles, that can include infantry fighting vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, and mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles. There's a large number in that category, well over average. 44 artillery systems, very high number of artillery pieces lost in a single day. And then when we look at the other categories, we have 63 vehicles and fuel tanks. That's a huge number there, and 10 pieces of special equipment. So this is a very bad day at the office for the Russians. Obviously, the question is always going to be, what's it like for the Ukrainians? When we look at the data for the Russian and Ukrainian losses that can be gleaned off the socials, we can see that those claims from the Ukrainian General Staff are generally supported by the data we are seeing. These are yesterday's stats from Andrew Perpetua. I missed them in terms of the time in my video yesterday and when he released them. But then we have today's stats here as well. So you can see that on both days, we're looking at a sort of 5-to-1 Russian to Ukrainian loss ratio. So despite how bad the Ukrainians are feeling it is on the front lines, and it is bad for them, they are struggling, they are losing territory in a number of places. The silver lining to that is it's costing the Russians inordinate amounts of personnel and equipment. The General Staff are claiming this, and the visually confirmed evidence supports this. And we'll go on to talk about actually FPV drone footage that is confirmed and analysed supports this as well. So some Ukrainians on the ground will be feeling like, woe is me. Naturally, they're in war and they're losing ground and it's terrible and their drones flying above and they're getting hit left, right and centre. But at the same time, the Russians are also getting hit and losing in so doing. So, you know, it's about contextually understanding this. It is so difficult because you hear like frontline troops and battalion commanders saying it's tough. Ukrainians are at a disadvantage. The Russians are using more drones, and etc. etc. And you're thinking, right, is that localized? View is that the Russians are really having the advantage there, but in general across the front lines, the Russians are having a hard time of it in terms of losing equipment, or can that be extrapolated across the front lines? And so that's kind of where I'm at the moment, trying to work this out. Now we have from the Ukrainian loss perspective, that NASAMS launcher that I talked about yesterday. Luckily, the launcher is the cheapest part of that. So you have within a battery, you have lots of sets of launchers, and each launcher it has a bunch of tubes on top. And if you lose that, you're not going to lose the capability really of the whole battery. So if you're going to lose something in the NASAMS battery, that's what you want to lose. And actually, there was talk about Ukraine's having something like 47 launchers in total. So it's quite a lot of those, even though they're very expensive. And you would hope that that's the sort of piece of kit that they could more easily replace than, say, the command and control part of that, or the radar part of that, so on and so forth. That was geolocated to, and indeed, I think, no, not that. Where were we? Oh, I've got this somewhere. Oh, it's from the comments. So Viggo Holmson, one of my commenters, saying the coordinates for the NASAMS that was lost was northwest of Zaporizhia. So I was wondering whether it's one that had been brought forward to do some offensive air defense work. So taking out Russian airframes that are flying nearer to the front line and releasing those guided glide bombs. Words are so difficult today. But actually, no, this was one that was in position northwest of Zaporizhia, so it's defensively protecting the city of Zaporizhia more likely. Thanks, Viggo, for that. Comms equipment, boat, Iraq. I talked about that self-propelled mortar yesterday. The video for that showing it had been destroyed. M777 damaged, a few tanks, a few BMPs. Nothing too crazy apart from that NASAMS launcher. And when we look at the Russian losses, there's a Strela 10 air defense system damaged, an electronic warfare, Psylocke electronic warfare piece of kit, some comms equipment, recovery vehicles, a number of artillery pieces, including a 240mm Tulip self-propelled mortar. Then we have a quite a large number, a massive number of tanks visually confirmed to have been lost. And then when you look at 24 tanks lost in the last 24 hours, according to General Staff, and then the day before, a whole bunch as well. Here we have T-80s, T-72s, different versions, different variants of the T-72, and indeed T-80. And then we come down to infantry fighting vehicles, losing quite a few of them, and APCs. Just a mass of equipment lost, as well as the usual kind of loaves and Desert Cross 1003 golf carts, trucks, and so on and so forth. Just a huge amount of equipment lost. Question will be, even taking all of those losses, is that negated by losing one NASAMS launcher? I would doubt it. I think these are some really heavy losses from the Russians, and it continued into yesterday. So this is Andrew Perpetua's stats from the last 24 hours. The previous one was from the previous 24 hours. We have an M777 destroyed artillery piece again, malfunctioned actually rather than being hit. BMP, a few BMPs. And a VAB there, that's a French-provided armoured personnel carrier, unknown cause. So quite a range of things, going from drones, ATGMs, Lancets, shelling for the Ukrainian losses. And then when we come to the Russian losses, again, we've got quite a mass of equipment here with some surveillance and comms equipment, a couple of multiple launch rocket systems taken out by Gimlers. Older but undocumented, so not from the last 24 hours. And in the tanks, we have a range including another T90M. This is the breakthrough tank, the newest and most capable of the Russian tanks. That was disabled by a mine and then hit by Baba Yaga. That's a big octocopter that can drop much more in terms of weight and numbers of IEDs, or it can even drop, I believe, other drones to act as a repeater mothership. So some mine rolling T-80s, that's going to be useful for the Ukrainians to take out. And then look at the list of infantry fighting vehicles. BMP-1s, BMP-2s, we've got BTR-82s destroyed. That looks like a whole Baba Yaga drone montage that has shown a number of bits of kit destroyed. Just a lot of stuff. And then again, these ATVs, including quad and the Desert Cross, the golf cart. So they are using a lot more of those vehicles. But yeah, just another mass of equipment lost by the Russians. There's another captured Bradley that's been confirmed, 72nd confirmed loss. and third confirmed capture. So they have used the Bradleys a lot, and they're using them because they are good. So even though they're old bits of kit, the Bradley, there are some people talking about why bother replacing Bradley with the new all singing, all dancing, whatever it might be, and whatever army you're talking about. The Bradley does a really good job, and the Ukrainians are enjoying using them, or they're getting a lot out of using them. Enjoyment's probably the wrong word, but yes, and as a result, they are going to obviously be losing a lot of these as well. The more you use something, the more likely you're going to lose it. Right, in occupied Melitopol, the GUR, so the Ukrainian intelligence, had corroborated with local partisans and destroyed military equipment and personnel there. And that was going back a couple of days, but confirmations coming through of that. A group of Russian invaders and their military equipment were targeted and destroyed in 2 explosions. The main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry and local resistance forces conducted a successful operation resulting in the defeat of the invaders and destruction of the equipment, including 2 Kamaz tilt trucks and a UAZ Patriot vehicle. So, yep, good stuff going on behind the lines there. Now we're just going to have a little look at and I love Tochny's analysis of the data. I love what Daniela always brings to the discussion. I've interviewed him a number of times. Go and check out my previous lives with him. So he's looking at, we're almost at we're at the back end of March, and the stats are looking, despite how bad it feels for the Ukrainians on the front line, particularly in certain areas like Ivanivsky, Chasiv Yar, it's pretty horrible for the Ukrainians there. They are losing ground. The Russians have an advantage, and we'll talk about that advantage in terms of localized FPV drone advantage. But here, Daniela says, we can start with the graphs that depict the strikes on infantry and vehicles. The data is based on information gathered by Andrew Perpetua and Geek. As I write the thread, the current situation is very different from what I expected. The current level of use of FPV drones from the Russian side has plummeted in all stats. And I know Greg and I disagree about this, because he's like, I'm speaking to the people on the ground and they say that it's terrible and the Russians have an advantage there. And that's coming from battalion commanders. But the social media published evidence suggests that actually across the whole of the front line, that appears not to be the case. And my kind of job is trying to work out what the truth is, combining all of these data points. Ukraine performed nearly the same number of strikes on infantry and vehicles in March, a week ahead of the month's end. So Ukraine have already achieved what they achieved last month on the 24th of March. This growth is swift, considering the initial numbers. And remember, February had a couple of days, there's 29 days in last February as opposed to 31 in March, but even given that, the growth is swift, considering the initial numbers and the apparent difficulties observed in December. There is still a week of data to collect, and we will see in the weeks to come if Russia has a backlog of information to release, or if there are simply fewer drones in operation. We will deal with the specific topic at the end. But right now, assuming this data is representative of what is happening, you have the Ukrainians using as many drones already this month as they did last month in strikes on infantry. So this is one particular subset of first-person view drones. So these isn't all drones. It's not reconnaissance drones. It's not IED dropping drones. These are first-person view drones that go in and blow things up. And this month of March, 24 days into it, they've outpaced what they did last month in February. And at the same point of this month, the Russians have had a massive decrease in the number of FPV drones, at least according to the publicly released data. Now, you might see a sudden jump as a whole flurry of data is released by the Russians, but assuming that's not going to happen, then this trajectory is exactly what the Ukrainians would want. Now, this is only strikes on infantry, as opposed to strikes on positions, trenches, buildings, or vehicles. Strikes on vehicles is following a similar trajectory as we've seen with the personnel. So almost the same amount of hits on vehicles that we saw last month in fewer days of this month. And then the Russian strikes have dropped by 2/3, right? Now, a lot of this on vehicles will be to do with the Ukrainians not using vehicles much. So if you don't use them, if you're not attacking the Russians with tanks and IFVs, then those things aren't going to be destroyed. If you're keeping them behind your lines by 10 kilometers plus, the Russians are going to be unable to do this. But what the Russians are still able to do would be to hit troops, right? Especially if you have broadly the same number of troops as you had last month, which, let's assume that's going to be fairly stable, even though that you're losing troops, right? So this is a trend that is, I think, important to note. The latest data, says Daniela, shows that Ukrainian forces have achieved remarkable results when it comes to striking enemy positions. So this is data that the Russians had the advantage up to now, basically every month up to now. So the data wasn't categorized effectively enough until we got to the end of the year and the beginning of this year. So I would actually exclude all of this, apart from to say that the Russians had a huge advantage. That advantage were when they were looking in much greater depth at the data. The Tochny crew in February showed that the Russians had an advantage of striking with FPV drones on positions, so trenches and buildings, and they were using them much more like you would traditionally have used mortars and artillery. And then the Ukrainians realized this, it seems, because this month they have smashed their data for strikes on positions. We're talking about positions here. Way more, by like almost 250 more strikes, going from 813 to 1062, and this month is a week away from being over, and the Russians are down at 652, so at a kind of 60%, or thereabout, 65% of what the Ukrainians have done in terms of FPV strikes on positions. That's a really important switch there. The latest data shows that Ukrainian forces have achieved remarkable results when it comes to striking enemy positions, managing to score more hits in less than a month. On the other hand, Russian forces seem to be struggling to keep up. Trenches remain the most hazardous place to be, as they account for a staggering 70% of strikes conducted so far. So strikes on positions are mainly strikes on trenches, then strikes on buildings, then strikes on bunkers. Houses, as opposed to... I don't know the difference between houses and buildings, so I'd have to ask Daniela about that. Houses... and then bunkers, and then buildings. And then you get basements, foxholes, and tree lines are added to those position data points. So that's interesting stuff. Obviously, trenches are going to be the main one. I say obviously because that's where so many of the troops are positioned. And then it's important to look at the graph below to understand the significance of the data collected. The bar chart displays a month-by-month comparison between Ukrainian and Russian FPV strikes after a decline in December, which suggested a potential advantage for the Russian forces. A steady growth in Ukrainian strikes is visible. In March, there were 423 more Ukrainian strikes than Russian strikes. This indicates that the Ukrainians are committed to using drones, particularly FPV, to deter the Russian military. So this is the advantage in total usage. Now, so the question is, right, if these battalion commanders and certain people on the front line are saying the Russians are using more than us, and they have the advantage, there are lots of questions that come out from that, because the data shows that the Ukrainians in general across the front lines, and this is not talking about localized, this is just generally in the month of March or the month of February, the Ukrainians are having quite a significant FPV drone advantage. So are the opinions of the Ukrainian military personnel, are they just incorrect, perception versus reality? So it seems like they have the advantage because every time they walk out, there are drones flying everywhere. The sound of drones is terrible. It's horrible. Our lives are horrible because we are being absolutely swarmed by drones. But that the Russians are equally being swarmed by drones, but this person doesn't know the reality of the number of drone units operating. So you might know, I know one drone unit operating, but I'm not aware of all the other 30 from all these other different components. Like I know my mate Jimmy's doing that, but everyone else I'm not aware of. And I don't realize that actually the Ukrainians are massively doing this to the Russians as well. So there is that, or is it that this person is correct that in the area this person is in, the Russians do have a significant drone advantage, but in other places along the front line, the Ukrainians have a drone advantage, and that drone advantage elsewhere overcompensates for the drone disadvantage in a given place. So you could talk about Chasiv Yar being a place where the Ukrainians have a drone disadvantage, and that's causing the loss of ground, and it's really significant and an important disadvantage. And then the idea is, well, woe is us, the Russians have a massive advantage over us, and I can't understand that this kind of data. Well, the data would be that overcompensation from other places on the front line. So, there are different ways of trying to explain where the opinions of personnel sit in line with this data. And the other explanation could also be that this data is incorrect, right? So there could be a selection bias whereby we're just seeing much more drone footage from the Ukrainians. Ukrainians are better at publishing the data, and the Russians are not very good at publishing the data. And as a result, it skews towards a bias that it seems like the Ukrainians are using more FPV drones, but the Russians are actually using more. They're just not publishing their data. So that is an argument, and we'll talk about that in a little while. So looking at the progression with a week to go, it's very well in line with the expected values. However, it's also possible to see a slight change in the rate of growth. At the moment, this is only a speculation. A few more weeks are needed to fully have a represented data set. So far, Ukraine is growing faster than Russia. This is well depicted by the plot of the total strikes from both sides, where the Ukrainian forces dominate with 10,289 strikes against 6,869, which is a considerable difference, total difference between the two. And you can see that this month it is looking, that gap between the two is looking wider than a gap in previous months. And that's what Daniela is talking about there. And the totals here, since they've been compiling this data, it shows you a very clear advantage to the Ukrainians. But all those discussion points I was just communicating to you are relevant for that data presentation. So it has been observed that the Russians are falling behind when it comes to night vision technology. This is an area where the Russians had a massive advantage, right? And this was also confirmed by the data. So if you're looking at January, there were 91 pieces of footage of the Russians using thermal drones and 10 of the Ukrainians. And then in February, 101 compared to 22. So the Ukrainians interestingly doubled over the month from January to February. And then March, they seem to have gone nuts on thermal drone usage, which is recognizing a problem and doing something about the problem. You can bet your bottom dollar that people like Commission and those Ukrainians behind the front lines in the halls of power will be working out ways of gaining the advantage and putting that in place. And it seems like that's happened. So at the moment, this point in a month, not only have the Ukrainians already almost quadrupled their use of thermal drones, but the Russians have only had a fifth of what they had the month before. Are we going to see a big publishing drop? I don't know. This issue is unlikely to be solely related to the reliability and availability of drones. Instead, it's more likely to be a problem with their incapability to adapt to changes. This may be due to the structure of the Russian army, which is unable to adapt quickly. The topic was discussed with Dima from Wild Hornet, so that's a Ukrainian drone manufacturer, and the discussion was hosted live by Tochny. It's one I haven't listened to yet, actually, really want to. Anyway, I'd like to address a comment that's been frequently seen in the comments section, which concerns information obtained through verbal communication with soldiers. Recently, myself, Jonathan MS Pierce, reported to us about news from Chasiv Yar claiming that there was a superiority in first-person view drone usage from the Russian side. However, if we look at the data from March 2024, we can see that there is a very large hot zone in Donetsk. If we examine the hot zone more closely, we find that the peak zone is located on the outskirts of Chasiv Yar. In other words, of all the places on the front line, Chasiv Yar is the place where the Russians have exacted a toll on the Ukrainians, have had a drone advantage. So if you're going to ask people from Chasiv Yar, then that is what you are you are going to get the sense that the Russians do have the advantage, because they definitely do have the drone advantage in the Chasiv Yar area. And that is possibly translating into, or helping to contribute to, a loss of ground there. So here we see the Russian drones in Ukraine, and you can see some hot points along the border, probably where the Ukrainians have been attacking across the border. Then you can see it's slightly cooler, but there is activity along that northeastern sector, right along the Kupiansk to Svatove to Crimea area. And then it's all red along the Bakhmut to Avdiivka, and then Robotyne, and also Dnipro River as well. And then if you zoom into here, this is Bakhmut here on the right. This is Chasiv Yar here on the left. And this is where the Russians are at present trying to attack. You've got Ivanivska, and then you've got Bodanivka sort of area up there. And that's where the Russians are using their drones to great effect. And here I think we have, I presume, is that the Bakhmut area there? I think so. And then you have, that looks like Bilahorivka up there, a little bit around, so on the way to Seversk. And then, Bakhmut, and then coming down to, I presume, Avdiivka here. And that looks like it could be around the canal area by Kurdyumivka there. So I'd need to look at that. It's not the clearest, that rendition of that image, but it seems like, as mentioned, Chasiv Yar is indeed a problem area for the Ukrainians. And as he goes on to say here, in a similar example, on the one carried to the one carried out, can be conducted with the FPV strikes executed by Ukrainian forces. The blue stars on the map here indicate the locations where FPV drone strikes were performed. Upon analysing the map, one can observe that there are various concentration areas where the strikes using FPV drones are being carried out. The areas of Stepova, Orlivka, Lastochkerna in particular, as a high density of FPV drone strikes, especially on the streets and tree lines. Other locations along the front have also been used as examples. This highlights the relevance of data geolocation and the importance of taking information with a grain of salt, especially when it comes from sources with limited situation awareness on the front line. It always is paramount to have general overview of the front line to understand where one of the two sides is using a specific resource more intensely. So all those same discussion points remain, and if the one of these data points is a battalion commander, then there are questions about, well, actually, does he have that general view and he disagrees with these data sets, in which case what's going on there? Or does a battalion commander not necessarily know what's going on in the next area just to the south? Here we have Avdiivka, where the Russians have been moving forward. The Ukrainians are on the defensive. The Ukrainians are losing land here. It is hard for them. But at the same time, these are all geo-confirmed, visually confirmed data points. So this isn't just pulling data out of one's posterior. This is genuinely confirmed data that shows that the Ukrainians are using masses of FPV drones in Avdiivka. So that while the Russians are advancing, they are advancing at a huge cost to the Russians in terms of vehicles and personnel, which is then reflected in what the general staff are claiming. It's then reflected in what we're seeing in the data points here, with the actual geo-confirmed and visually confirmed losses of equipment. But what this doesn't tell you, remember, this is just FPV drones. It doesn't tell you about the use of reconnaissance drones. It doesn't tell you about the use of IED dropping drones. And it doesn't tell you about the use of mortars, artillery, and aviation. So in this area of the front line, where we have the Russians advancing in Avdiivka, and you look at this and you say, right, the Ukrainians are hammering the Russians with FPV drones. The Russians are losing heaps of kit, right? But the Russians are also advancing. How are they doing that? Because A, they're losing that kit and it doesn't really matter for them. They just want to take the territory. But also they're using masses of artillery at a rate that's 5 to 7 times the amount that the Ukrainians are using artillery. And as good as FPV drones are, there is not the same as using a barrage of artillery that hammers a trench line, right? You can use these effectively and they can be a real nuisance and they can take out individual pieces of equipment. But the god of war still is artillery. And if you're adding to that the aerial bombs dropped by the Russian VKS, these guided glide bombs that are causing immense amount of damage, up to like 1,500 kilograms of explosives. We are hearing about 3,000 kilogram versions as well. The Russians are able to withstand the barrage of drone attacks in an area like this and still move on, because they are obliterating the Ukrainian positions with the use of much bigger explosives. So this is just FPV drone usage, and you could get a false sense of the holistic reality here by just looking at the FPV drone usage. You know, well done Ukraine, aren't Ukraine doing well? Well, they are in that kind of area, but at the same time, the Russians are also absolutely battering the Ukrainians. They're just doing it with different munitions. So we need to understand all of these parts, and then the end result is, at least for me, is that the Russians in certain areas will be having some success. I was going to show you on a map, but it's not in a good place. The Russians will be having certain areas of great success. The Ukrainians are really suffering in terms of personnel losses. They aren't suffering massively in terms of equipment losses. The Russians are losing huge amounts of equipment, but they're still able to replace that equipment with their vast stockpiles, and they're able to replace the personnel with their vast stockpiles of humans. And as they move forward, they're taking these losses. The Ukrainians are taking big losses as well, but not nearly as many losses as the Russians. But to the Ukrainians, those smaller numbers of losses have a greater impact than the bigger number of losses to the Russians, arguably. And so even though the ratios are very firmly in support of, in Ukraine's favor, the argument is, well, the discussion is that still enough? Okay, right, moving on. Distant strikes here overnight. I'm going to start with what the Russians did, start with the bad news, move on to the good news. The bad news is that Russia again attacked Ukraine with a massive barrage of missiles and drones. So overnight, Russia again attacked Ukraine with a combination of missiles and drones. Out of 57 aerial targets, 43 were destroyed. So a really good interception rate last night. 18 out of 29 cruise missiles and 25 out of 28 Shahed drones. Interesting that there weren't too many, or at least I'm not aware of too many ballistic missiles being used. There might have been, but yeah, so a better interception rate last night. And again, the question would be, why didn't they use the same number of missiles and Shahed drones as they used 2 nights ago? Or 3 nights ago, actually. Where you had 160 and now we've got 57. And again, it's the same thing I'm going to tell you. You would if you could, you aren't so you can't. So the reason is they don't have that many missiles and drones to use. Or they're stockpiling them from some other reason, but you would think they'd want to capitalize on overwhelming the defenses a few nights ago. You would really have thought they would do this the very next night, but they didn't. So I think there's going to be production and procurement issues with getting these munitions to the places that you need to take off with them from airports. So you need to make them, move them, and use them. And all of that takes time. And the Russians clearly aren't able to do that 2 nights in a row, it appears. But they have done it with a night in between, but actually the level of usage is lower than it was previously. So that should tell you something. Right, in terms of the drones alone last night, a total of 34 were used, 31 were destroyed, and they were spread all around Ukraine: Poltava, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv. In fact, if we go back to no reports here, Russian cruise missile violated the airspace of Poland. We're going to talk about that in a second. So it flew around Poland for 39 seconds, which is a very long time for a missile, all things considered. But we'll talk about that soon. Let's now just look at the map of where these... In fact, there's a more recent one map than this. Let me find it. No, I stand corrected. The other one was from 2 nights ago, but it's interesting you can compare. So this is last night, and you just had these cruise missiles and the drones, and this is the route that they take, and you can see that some of them do a little bit of funky going around a dogleg here. That's the one that went into Poland, and as mentioned, we'll talk about that soon, and hits Lviv, so comes in from behind to try and get around certain air defences. This is what happened the other night with a massive 161, where you've got different types of missiles. Some of these are just straight up and down, very much more ballistic trajectory, where it goes up into the atmosphere and then comes down very quickly, and you can't shoot them down. And these cruise missiles can evade air defences and move around, and as you can see from this one here, almost do a 360 degree move around some kind of target there. I don't know if that's Khmelnytsky, something like Starokonstantinov Air Base, but yeah, you have certain missiles doing all sorts of things. So here, a missile comes round, I don't know, it seems to have come from that direction, has been located finally here, then is seen to come almost back to where it originally was. I don't know where the route was prior to this point of it suddenly popping up on the radars. But yeah, just really interesting how many of these go in different directions, and you can see some of the drones here doing dog legs, trying to evade certain air defenses, as or also trying to find out where the air defenses are for the next attack. But here we have other missiles as well, different types of ballistic missiles fired off from either from inside Crimea, so ground launch ones, or I presume rather than air launch ones from there, you might be air launched from Crimea actually, and other air launch ones from the Azov Sea, I presume, rather than sea launch. I don't think the Black Sea Fleet are active in terms of releasing these missiles, which could also explain why you have smaller barrages like this, because they don't have the ability to fire them, or they have the ability to fire them, but it's too risky for them to do so from ships in the Black Sea. Anyway, there you go. That's I think a useful infographic. Several fires are reported burning at locations in Lviv region, western Ukraine, after Russian cruise missile attacks took place earlier. So I don't know what the success of the Russian strikes was last night, but things would have been hit, but the interception rate was also pretty good. Now, a Russian missile flew into Polish airspace and it stayed there for 39 seconds. If you count 39 seconds, that's a long time for something travelling that quickly. And the question for me is, okay, well, let's talk about what's happened first, and then we'll do a little bit of discussion. So Poland scrambled their fighter jets amid the drone and missile attack on Ukraine. Poland scrambled their jets to protect Polish airspace during Russia's drone and missile attacks. They didn't do anything about it. Poland could have shot down a Russian missile if it had flown further, Defense Ministry, so it's a bit kind of arbitrary as how far it has to fly into Polish airspace to do something, and 39 seconds is a long time travelling at that speed, and that covers a lot of ground. It is noted that the Russian missile stayed in Polish airspace for 39 seconds at an altitude of 400 metres, speed of 800 kilometres an hour. Missile flew 1.5 to 2 kilometres deep into Poland. During the incident, 4 F-16 fighters, 2 Polish and 2 Americans, flew into the air. Quote, the effectors, that is, the missiles that the pilots have on board, could have shot down the object if it had gone deeper and was a threat, said the advisor to the Polish defense minister. Now, what's important to note here for me is that this is a missile that's being used to destroy something in Ukraine, but is going through Polish territory. Now, what would Poland do if they had 600 troops that were traveling on infantry fighting vehicles along the same amount of land that cruise missile covered, but that they weren't going to attack Poland? They were just driving through Poland on their infantry fighting vehicles to eventually attack the west of Ukraine. What would the Polish do if you had armed soldiers travelling through Poland, Russian armed soldiers? Would they just sit back and go, well, you're only a couple of kilometres in, so we're not going to do anything, but, let us know when you're out and we'll just say that we scrambled some soldiers? I think this is really dodgy, because this is then, if nothing's done about this, then this is giving the green light for the Russians to use Polish airspace to attack Ukraine. What's the difference between a cruise missile flying through Polish airspace and a Su-34 or whatever flying through Polish airspace? These are destructive weapons, effectively, flying through or travelling through Polish territory. That they've not done anything about that, I think, is bad news. and it's a green light for Russia to continue doing things like that. You should shoot that down. Now, the flip side to that argument is you shoot a cruise missile down, it falls into Poland and damages stuff in Poland. And actually, it's safer for Poland in a very myopic sense. Safer for Poland to allow that cruise missile, because it's almost certainly going to come out of Poland and fly into Ukraine, let it go and do its thing in Ukraine. That's like not challenging the troops as they come through Poland, because it's going to cause damage to your own troops, and there'll be issues in Poland rather than let them go through and go into Ukraine. But do you let troops come through your territory to go into Ukraine? No, you don't. So something has to be done about this. I feel really strongly on this. Let me know what you think, guys. So, right, so that was a bad news for Ukraine. The good news, which was I did a breaking news piece on earlier in the evening about this, is that Ukraine absolutely hammered Crimea with a whole bunch of their own cruise missiles. They hit Sevastopol, Simferopol, Chornomorsk, Yevpatoria, Belbek Air Base, so on and so forth. There's an awful lot of imagery of explosions taking place and air defense working, but a lot of explosions on the ground in all of these places. Sevastopol, lots of explosions happening there, to the point where, and here, Cape Fearland, Inkerman, to the point where it was claimed early doors that ships might well have been targeted. And lo and behold, what we hear now is that indeed 2 ships have been hit. So on top of that, apparently one of the targets was the Information and Computing Center of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, which is a site absolutely festooned with SATCOM antennas. This is a high-value target within Sevastopol that appears to have been successfully struck by the Ukrainians. It's been geolocated. Ukraine's Air Force commander at the time was really satisfied with the results, saying the sky and sea are the same color. Thanks to the pilots and sailors for successful combat work, Crimea is ours together to victory. And that's Oleschuk saying that. And then tonight, information is coming out that the missile strikes were confirmed on positions in Sevastopol that have been geolocated. Building near there was used as the headquarters of naval forces of Ukraine, but a new Russian unit had moved in. So there are certain units that have been targeted inside Sevastopol. And then you've got, big old explosions and air defense explosions too, concerning that barrage. Tim White says sustained attack causing the closing of the Kerch Bridge. Explosions not looking like just general buildings. There are secondary explosions going off in some of these hits, so something big has been hit. And now we're hearing that 2 craft, the Yamal and the Azov, large amphibious ships, and a communication center, as well as several infrastructure facilities, were hit in Crimea, and that's going to be a bad day at the office for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, again getting hammered. Here is an infographic to show these 2 vessels being added to the Black Sea Fleet, number of vessels that have been taken out. And these are the larger ships, these vessels that have been hit. Not the, obviously the Moskva is the flagship one, and you got some other, I presume, destroyers or frigates or whatever. But these large amphibious landing ships are really important if Russia are going to want to attack places like Odessa and whatnot. So officially confirmed, says Anton Gerashchenko, in Sevastopol, the Ukrainian Defense Forces successfully hit large landing ships Yamal and Azov, communication centers, several infrastructure facilities. That's the General Staff of Ukraine reported that. OSINT Technical reports that at least 3 Storm Shadow missiles hit the main communication center of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. According to OSINT Technical Project, military units of missile gunners and FSB are also located there. Last night, the most massive attack for the entire time of the SMO was carried out on Sevastopol, official Russian channels wrote. According to the occupation authorities on the peninsula, allegedly the air defense system shot down several dozen missiles, including British Storm Shadow missiles, on their approach to the city. The occupiers confirmed that the main communication center of the Russian Black Sea Fleet was a target. According to Russian media, 34 military personnel were killed, 40 wounded, and 3 Su-27 airplanes were damaged at the Belbek airfield. So that's going to be important as well. There's still some fires going off. So this is a railside oil depot in Fardiska in Crimea, that is still burning this morning, as you can see. So significant damage done to the Russian capabilities in the area. A number of airplanes possibly taken out, a number of ships possibly taken out, and arguably just as importantly, some really crucial military infrastructure as well, like a sort of computing command center might disable the Russians just as much as taking out the actual ships themselves. So we'll wait to see what the overall effect of the attacks on Crimea and any more information that comes through. Right, I've been talking way too long. I'm going to leave this bit for the next video, which will be geopolitical stuff and military equipment. So anyway, you can look forward to that soon. In the meantime, take care, speak soon, Toodle Pips.